But we begin looking in Australia and New Zealand. Chinese Premier Li Qiang met with Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese on Monday after having arrived in Australia over the weekend. Premier Li saying that China is ready to work with Australia to build a more mature, stable, and fruitful partnership. The two leaders met at the 9th China-Australia Annual Leaders Meeting in Australia's capital of Canberra. At the weekend visit, Li toured the city of Adelaide and its zoo, where it offered to send Australia 2 new pandas to replace the ones going back to China at the end of this year. Premier Li arriving in Australia 3 days after being in New Zealand. The two sides announced new agreements on trade, environmental, and other issues. Before leaving, Li visited New Zealand dairy giant Fonterra. Okay, a lot to unfold in that short but important visit, and joining us now for more insight into the Chinese Premier's visit to the region is Josef Gregory Mahoney. He is in Shanghai. He is a professor of politics and international relations at East China Normal University. As always, thanks for being with us. Let's kind of get right to it. What do you believe the highlights of Li Qiang's visits to both countries so far was? Clearly, they had both countries, Australia and the United States and China, trying to mend some fences.
Well, I think on the whole, it's a very positive visit, and I think it represents a more substantial, so-called mini détente and stabilization of ties than what we've seen progressing between Beijing and Washington over the past year. And we might come to see this visit as an inflection point for improving ties. That said, I think we also have to note that this visit didn't simply come out of nowhere, that the ties have been getting warmer since 2022, when a new government was elected in Australia and took steps to improve the relations, including sending high-level visits to China last year, and that certainly paved the way for Premier Li to visit Canberra. And then, of course, he went onward to New Zealand. But one of the big goals, of course, is that we may see this paving the way for President Xi to visit the two countries in the near future and further solidify the improving ties.
Yeah, you really touched on one thing that I think is very important, the fact that there have been talks, there have been meetings going on, if not in the top of the headlines, certainly very important meetings, as you mentioned, since 2022, and China's relationship with Australia has simply been rocky before that, and they only resumed trade at the end of last year. What does this signify, and how important is reopening trade, sort of an olive branch between these two important countries?
Well, let's be clear. The relations really went off track around 2018, when the previous government began to take a lot of provocative actions against China, and China reciprocated with restrictions that affected trade. And what we've seen is those restrictions slowly being unwound. That both sides realizing that they have a lot in common, that they have a lot of common ground, particularly in the areas of trade, that they need to improve for the well-being of both countries, and certainly the well-being of the people of both countries. So this is something that has been taking place. Of course, the broader context is that as the Foreign Minister of Australia said, that one can't simply rewind the relationship, that there is sort of a permanent competition paradigm in place. And this is in part due to the fact that a recent poll in Australia showed, a poll this month, I believe, showed that 53% of Australians still view China as a greater security threat than trading partner. And so as a result, I think we have a government in Canberra that wants to move forward, that wants to improve ties, but has to continue to be sensitive to the fact that a lot of their people, the majority of their people, have been affected by this poisoning discourse that has been perpetuated against China globally. But at the same time, also Canberra still has to worry about not finding itself too far afield from Washington. So I think we're still going to see pressures on things related to strategic minerals and other tech concerns.
And we also have to point out the Chinese investment in Australia fell by 57% last year from the year before. Explain this drop, and what sectors do you believe Chinese businesses are still investing in, and is China still interested in buying property in Australia?
Well, I don't think the property is, certainly this is something that a lot of Chinese investors are personally interested in as property. But when we look at the broader strategic interest, China is interested in securing those mineral resources that they need in order to move forward with a high-tech innovation economy. And this is where we've seen pressures from Canberra forcing 5 Chinese firms to divest their interest in certain strategic mineral firms in Australia. So the problem is, in part, certainly there were things like we've seen in the U.S. and certainly in Australia, but there are these local concerns that Chinese consumers are buying up Australian properties and pushing up prices and somehow compromising the local security. But the bigger picture is really about whether or not they're going to be able to grow in the new economy in this fourth industrial revolution. And it's not simply the idea that they might face restrictions now, but what are the restrictions that we're going to face long term? Because a lot of these investments are looking at a long-term scenario, and there's a lot of uncertainty.
Let's switch to New Zealand right now. New Zealand was the first developed nation to sign a bilateral free trade agreement with China. That happened back in the year 2008. It expanded in 2022. It appears the two countries' trade ties still remain strong. What key goods and services are being exchanged between these two nations, and how important is it?
Well, I think something that was highlighted during the visit was dairy. I think what's really remarkable about the New Zealand China relationship is, of course, that there are concerns that New Zealand is at risk for getting sucked into this AUKUS vortex, and certainly Premier League raised that. But as the New Zealand Prime Minister noted, that New Zealand-China relations have been much more stable, and I think certainly relative to Australia-China relations, and certainly relative to U.S.-China relations, that there's been more continuity from regardless of which party has been in power. She interestingly said that there was a 50-50 in terms of the positives and the differences that they discussed, but that and while these were sometimes uncomfortable, that nevertheless the two countries were mature and capable of working through their differences in order to emphasize their common ground.
Thank you very much. As always, Josef Gregory Mahoney, we certainly appreciate your insight. Thanks again.